Okay, it looks like we are live. All right, so go ahead and let's get the questions in via Twitter. All right, so we are going live for APUSH Q&A. All right. Send me your questions via Twitter. Okay. So send me your questions via Twitter. Hopefully you're on tomritchie.net/apush, but if you're on YouTube, that's fine too. All right. So send questions via Twitter. Okay. So let's see if the questions start going in. I just tweeted my Twitter followers, and it looked like APUSH won the poll. So I will do something coming up for Euro. I promise. If you're an AP European History student, I'll have something coming up for you pretty soon. But I thought I'd chat with the APUSH crowd just a little bit tonight and see what's going on. We do have midterms coming up and all of that kind of stuff. All right, so let's check and see. All right, we got about 22 people in here right now. Remember, questions via Twitter. Okay, questions via Twitter. Let me know what you've got here, and let's see what we've got. And also, Instagram. I can always check Instagram if anybody's got a question there. Twitter and Instagram are both at Tom Ritchie. And so let's see what's going on there. Random account 1776 just followed me on Instagram. Looks like a new account of some sort, kind of random, thus the name of the account. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, still waiting for questions. All right. Twitter at Tom Ritchie. Shoot me some questions. All right. Not seeing any questions yet, but anyway, this might be a good time as any. If you are on tomritchie.net/apush, you can see a link to my Romulus APUSH review app, which you might want to get a hold of. It's available at the App Store and at Google Play. Let me go ahead and share my screen real quick. We've got the live hangout going on here. My 8-month writing clinic is a great resource if you're looking for step-by-step tutorials on on the DBQ and the LEQ for APUSH and AP Euro. So APUSH, Romulus APUSH Review. If you click here, the Romulus APUSH Review app is available at the App Store. Also is available on Google Play, which I think I need to. Okay, so I've got the iTunes link there, but it is on the Google Play Store. I need to update that to show that it's on both iTunes, and Google Play. So that is available. It's just a little $2.99 trivia app. It's not, the questions aren't stimulus based. They're not intended to be. It's there to reinforce information. Okay, for you, this is good for your DBQ, LEQ, SAQs when you're having to actually, think of things that are, coming up and put them on the paper. All right, looks like we've got a little bit of activity on Twitter. Let's see what we've got here. What medical advancements were made during the Civil War? Well, a lot of amputations and stuff like that. That's something that is not really going to be on the exam. And so Katie Ann, all right. So shout out to FDHS. All right. So different interpretations of the Reconstruction era. Okay. So there are a few ways that somebody can look at Reconstruction. Certainly what's going on here, you've got at first presidential Reconstruction and radical Reconstruction. Now, Hip Hughes, my friend Hip Hughes, has a great video called Hugs and Slugs, which I find interesting. First of all, he goes into presidential Reconstruction, Lincoln, and then his Vice President Johnson. Now, Lincoln, was largely, remember in his second inaugural address, he said, with malice toward none and charity for all, he's really trying to bring the South back into the Union. Remember that for Abraham Lincoln, certainly he was the great emancipator, signed the Emancipation Proclamation and all of that kind of stuff, helped push the 13th Amendment through Congress. But remember that Lincoln's goal the whole time was to preserve the Union. This was his #1 war aim. And so as far as that's concerned, Lincoln wanted to be generous to the South. In the last public speech that Lincoln gave, there were members of Congress, radical Republicans. Now, remember, you've got, different wings just like today. I mean, there are Republicans who like President Trump. There are Republicans who don't like President Trump. There's the Bernie wing of the Democratic Party, more progressive. There's the more moderate wing of the Democratic Party. Very similar with that. That Abraham Lincoln, was not a radical, but he did have a radical faction of his own party that wanted to see like not only emancipation. So Lincoln felt like, okay, we need to have emancipation. That's non-negotiable, but the rest of it should really be up to the southern states that are coming back into the Union. But the radicals, they didn't like the black codes that were coming out. Now, one thing that you want to remember is that the black codes are presidential Reconstruction. Jim Crow laws are post-Reconstruction segregation laws. So you want to make sure that's one thing that I see a lot of students mess up on, the black codes versus Jim Crow. So something presidential Reconstruction and then afterwards. And so, southern states are passing these black codes, which, are basically saying that remember Dred Scott was still the law of the land, which said that a person of African descent was not a citizen of the United States. And so, according to, these laws that were being passed, these freedmen and women, while they weren't slaves, they also were not given the rights of American citizens. And the radical Republicans had a big problem with that. They wanted freedmen and women, freedmen to be able to vote. Of course, you could look at the self-interested side of that. There was a historical school that was dominant for, several decades, maybe even more than a century, that was focusing on the self-interested nature of the radical Republicans. Like, of course, they want to enfranchise the freedmen because the freedmen are voting. Okay, they're voting for the Republican Party. And Thaddeus Stevens said as much in a speech that he wanted to make sure that the party of the Union, the Republican Party, continued to be dominant, and the Democratic Party wasn't going to challenge the Republican Party's dominance again. Now, of course, at the same time, as we have increasingly found ourselves in a society that has more egalitarian views on race, it is, a lot of people have tended, a lot of historians have tended to emphasize, the benevolent factors of this, that radical Reconstruction is trying to, ensure the rights of African Americans through the 14th and the 15th Amendment. And so, the difference between the moderate, like Lincoln Republicans, who were basically like, look, we want emancipation, but leave the rest up to the states. It's not going to happen overnight. And then there are the radicals who want to bring about, basically a social revolution in the South. And of course, for whatever reasons historians can debate, you've got a combination of resistance in the South, but also kind of, a lack of support in the North. Sometimes people forget that people in the North were pretty racist too. And this wasn't a big priority for the Northern taxpayer to be supporting radical Reconstruction policies. So with that, I mean, a pretty, pretty complex period, but just like anything else in history, different ways to interpret that. Okay, so as far as that, let's see what else we've got here. All right, so during the period 1804, okay, I think Embryo wants me to do his homework. That's not why I'm here. Not why I'm here. What made new immigrants significant to political machines? Okay, now political machines. This is a system where you've got, of course, in the antebellum era. Now it's important to know these waves of immigrants. So in the antebellum era, the Irish and German immigrants, they come in, and especially the Irish, because the Irish tended to stay in cities. You still got large Irish populations in, Irish American populations in Rhode Island and Massachusetts and New York, whereas Germans tended to move inland. That's why you got a lot of German Americans in Pennsylvania and the Midwest, because they're moving out there and they're going on to farms. But what would happen is, if you got off the boat from Ireland, or of course the new immigrants, as we talk about the 20th century, immigrants from Italy and Greece and Russia and Poland and places like that, they get off the boat and there's this person that says, hey, Let me help you find a place to stay. Let me help you find a job, and let me help you with this and that. Let me help you get into this immigrant community. Well, of course, there's always a bit of a return there. In a democratic society, votes matter. And so people do things to get votes. And so, the machine would help you find a job. They would help you get integrated into the community. And in return, you were supposed to support, the machine candidates, which would typically be part of the Democratic Party. That is one thing that's kind of consistent throughout the history of party politics. Is that recent immigrants, even though the parties have realigned here and there, recent immigrants have typically been much more likely to support the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. So that's basically the way that a political machine worked. And you can kind of see why there was a lot of corruption in these machines, because, they're doing favors in return for votes. And of course, once they get those votes, they can put people in offices, in the city, in the state, so on and so forth. And of course, in the federal government too, before the Pendleton Civil Service Act. All right. Completely lost on multiple choice. Okay. Now, of course, with multiple choice, one thing, Jada, is to remember that not every incorrect answer is a wrong answer. Okay. So, just because, it makes a true statement doesn't make it correct. Okay. So what three things that I look for relevance. I look for whether it's in the right period or place. And then I look at, is it an accurate statement? So is it an accurate statement is really only one of three criteria. So a correct answer is going to be in the correct period and place. It is going to be relevant, and it's going to be correct. Now, if you're completely lost, you're just going to have to guess, and also trust your instincts, because if you can't trust your instincts, then you're not going to pass anyway. Okay, if your instincts for U.S. history are so bad that you can't trust them, and they're going to lead you astray, you've already failed your exam before you even walked in that room. That's just the honest truth. So no matter who you are, you should trust yourself. You don't have anything to lose. Can I explain the Compromise of 1850? Okay, so the Compromise of 1850, what you're seeing going on there is that, you've had the Mexican-American War and the Mexican Cession. Now, of course, the Wilmot Proviso, which the Free Soilers had tried to introduce several times, it never passed, but it still was a very, vibrant policy statement. Okay, so it was trying to say that none of this land is going to be open to slavery. Now, remember, before the Mexican-American War, there was almost like this exchange, that for every free state there's a slave state, and you're trying to keep the balance of free and slave states. Now, once the free soil movement comes along, they're saying, look, we don't like slavery spreading anymore. So the free state slave state thing, that's done. And of course, the South, the Southern Congress people, they're not too happy about this, because this is the deal that they'd been used to. So California petitions, without even being organized as a territory, they petition to come into the Union as a free state. And of course, a lot of Southern congressmen have a problem with this, because what they envisioned was California is a large state. It should be cut in two. Northern California be a free state, Southern California be a slave state. Free Soilers aren't having it. President Zachary Taylor at the time wasn't having it. And so really, in order to get California admitted into the Union, they had to figure out some other things that they could play around with. So what they did is they created a series of bills. Now, they couldn't even make one big bill, because they couldn't get the coalition. They couldn't get a coalition together that would support the whole package. So what they did is they get together with some of the Upper South congressmen. Now, keep in mind, like the Fugitive Slave Act is really aimed at congressmen from Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, Missouri, Virginia, places that were close to free states, because if you're in Mississippi or Alabama, you don't really care about a fugitive slave law. Okay, they don't have anywhere to go. And so the fugitive slave law was, aimed at some of these congressmen from the Upper South. And what it did was it made the federal government particularly responsible, like directly responsible for the enforcement of collecting fugitive slaves. Now, this is already in the Constitution. Like today, if my car gets stolen and somebody drives my car to Georgia, they'll deal with it. The police in Georgia will find my car and I'll be notified and I'll be able to go pick my car up. Okay. So if your property gets taken to another state, it is returned to you. Now, the problem is that slaves were being, at least from the Southern perspective, we don't see this as a problem today, of course, but from the perspective of these Southern congressmen, their slaves were getting away, and then they'd get to some of these northern states that wouldn't cooperate in order to return their property. And so they said basically the federal government being put in charge made sure that it basically took the state out of it, which that's kind of the irony, because a lot of times the South is, associated with states' rights, but this is actually creating a larger federal government. So the Fugitive Slave Act, gets some of these upper South congressmen like, okay, maybe we'll vote for this California thing. Now, then we've got to figure out what are we going to do in the new territories. Okay, so the other thing, you've got to organize this Mexican cession other than California. So what they do is they decide that the New Mexico territory, and later New Mexico and Utah, or whatever they're going to call it, that they say that, instead of Congress deciding the status of slavery, let the settlers decide, squatter sovereignty or popular sovereignty. Okay, so just let the settlers decide, the status of slavery. Okay, and then they had to deal with the issue of Texas. Now, Texas claimed that their boundary included Santa Fe, all right, New Mexico. Like they had this huge idea of what Texas was. The federal government disagreed. So we've got to resolve this. So then the next provision of the Compromise of 1850 is Texas is paid $10 million to settle their war debt from their War of Independence. And then in return for that, Texas agrees to be the Texas that they are today. And this basically takes some land away from a slave state, puts it into this territory that's going to be decided by popular sovereignty as far as the status of slavery. Then finally, it's like one of those things like, and you notice how I'm breaking this into parts. I say, okay, California's a free state, fugitive slave law. That's two. Then you've got the Mexican cession. So you've got popular sovereignty and then the Texas settlement. Okay, so that is 3 and 4. Now we go to Washington, D.C. It's one of those things sometimes when you're fighting with somebody, you're like, okay, you know what? While we're fighting, let's just go ahead and throw everything on the table, okay? Because this has been a pretty bad fight, so let's just get everything out there. And that's what they do. And there's been a conflict over slavery in Washington, D.C., with a lot of northern congressmen having a problem with the existence of slavery in the nation's capital. It was embarrassing. I mean, foreign diplomats are coming over from Europe where slavery was already illegal. And they're seeing like all of these slaves, they're seeing these slave auctions. Now, the other side of it is that these Southern congressmen, a lot of times you tend to think about slavery as somebody working in a field, but these Southern congressmen, these were rich guys that would have what was called a body man. And this was somebody who would follow them around. Basically, when they went to Washington, D.C., came with them, did their laundry, got the paper in the morning, helped them get dressed, prepared their meals. And so, these Southern congressmen are indignant because, this is the nation's capital. I should be able to bring my property into the nation's capital. So what they do to settle this, and once again, this compromise here, is that they decide to outlaw the slave trade in Washington, D.C. And so that way, the foreign diplomats and visitors aren't seeing slave auctions, but then the Southern congressmen can still bring their body servants into the capital. So with all of these 5 things, California is a free state. Then we have the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, remember, a stronger Fugitive Slave Act, because there was already a Fugitive Slave Act of like 1793, but they strengthen it and they make the federal government responsible. Now, the other thing about the Fugitive Slave Act is to note that it was the most controversial. Like, this is the part, like the Compromise of 1850, Henry Clay thought, okay, this is going to basically solve everything once and for all. This is going to be the last time we're ever going to have to compromise, and argue about this stuff. But, it was the last time they compromised, but for different reasons, because compromise pretty much died with that Henry Clay generation. And so, as far as that goes, then you go to to the west, and you see the popular sovereignty, the Texas settlement, and then finally getting rid of the slave trade, rather than slavery itself. All right, so all kinds of compromises and settlements. All right, let me just take a quick look at Instagram, see if we have any activity over there. Just real quick, like, okay, no activity on Instagram. Okay, so if anybody were following me on there, give you a little shout out. All right, so as far as that goes, let me go back to Twitter and see what we've got here. All right, talking about the compromise. Okay, excellent. Miss Lennox's class. Thank y'all so much for watching. All right, now the split of the abolitionist movement. Now the thing is, I think there was a split in the abolitionist movement, but that's not really something that's going to come up. It's really going to be more. Remember, we have to know the difference between abolitionism and free soil. Okay, so the free soil, the abolitionist, and it's hard for us to see this today because today everybody knows that slavery is wrong, slavery is immoral. There's a general agreement about that. But at this time, the whole concept of slavery is something that was not only immoral but needs to be gotten rid of right now. That's something that did not even have a consensus in the North before the Civil War. If you watch the Lincoln movie, you can see this process by which the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, that was hard to get the 2/3 vote in Congress, and that was just with the Union. This wasn't like the Southerners were in there. This was just the states that were in the Union that originally the 13th Amendment in 1865 did not have overwhelming support, that pushed it through right there. Some people, they've got this idea that the Confederacy, slavery was legal and everything was all, shiny and flowery. Of steam there. Now, of course, you've got Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, which is changing some attitudes towards slavery. But a lot of people are really in the North are really seeing it like Lincoln saw it at that time. That slavery should not spread. And so that's really, I think that if you want to tie this to the Civil War, you can think about how really, I think a more decisive factor is the rise of a more palatable anti-slavery movement in the North. When you look at free soil, which also appealed to people's racist tendencies. I often use the term white West to talk about free soil because, a lot of these settlers, they want to go out West. They don't want to compete with slave labor. They don't want to be around black people. Their own propaganda pretty much appealed to a lot of this racist sentiment. Keep slavery in the South. We don't want it to spread. And so I think that when you see the free soil movement gaining steam, I think that, you could definitely tie that to the Civil War. Okay, the whiskey ring, Katie, I would say, I mean, I've never seen, and that's one of the advantages of seeing this. Oh, Katie, you got quite a bit of followers. Wow. I should follow back. There we go. But of course, you can always ask another question. Now, the whiskey ring, I just wouldn't necessarily. Now, I think, is that one of those Grant scandals? Like, you've got that whole plethora of scandals. There's a Wikipedia page just dedicated to scandals in the Grant administration. So I wouldn't necessarily see that on an exam. But the election of 1876, which is the election of 1876, which was this election, of course, Grant has done 2 terms, and Grant was the only president that supported radical Reconstruction. All right, so Grant, supported radical Reconstruction, but a lot of public support had eroded in the North. Even like moderate Republican papers like Harper's Weekly, Thomas Nast, you should know about Thomas Nast if you're going to take the APUSH exam. The paper Harper's Weekly, which was a moderate Republican paper, in 1865, they printed a cartoon with a wounded black soldier, and it said the franchise and not this man. Lady Liberty is helping him hold himself up. He's on crutches. So Harper's Weekly in 1865 was like, couldn't at least the veterans vote? Couldn't like some of the African American population vote? Maybe not all of them, at least the ones who fought in the war. Come on. Now, by 1875, Harper's Weekly had a cartoon that, basically showed this, black dominated legislature, and it showed Lady Liberty like all upset. It looked like there was disorder and chaos. So even, factions of the Republican Party were tired of radical Reconstruction. They thought that it had gone too far. There was this perception of quote unquote colored rule, which of course there's been a lot of, revisionism in the history of Reconstruction, lately. But at that time, certainly, a lot of public opinion in the North was turning against radical Reconstruction as well. And of course, in the South, you've got the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, and then the so-called Redeemer governments that restored white democratic rule. And so what happened here in 1876 is when that election happened, there were only 3 states that had not restored white democratic rule. And those states were Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida, which I've lived in 2 of those states, and I like to vacation in the other one. So that's how I'm able to remember those states very easily. Plus, it's my job too, right? And so these states all had Reconstruction governments with, with some, not a large, federal troop presence, but some troops that were propping up the Republican governments. And so what happened is Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida in 1876, they sent 2 slates of electors. The election was disputed in these states. And so, basically, the Congress creates a commission that had 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats. Now, of course, this commission voted along party lines that the Republican won. But what happens here is now there's never anything written down, just like the corrupt bargain with Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams. They weren't like, hey, let's make a corrupt bargain. This isn't written down anywhere, but certainly there seems to be kind of an unsettled, kind of an unwritten kind of understanding that, okay, you know what, these 3 states are going to back off and just let the Republican take the presidency. And in return, Rutherford B. Hayes, or as some people called him, Rutherfraud after that election, Rutherford B. Hayes would not enforce radical Reconstruction. Now, the thing is, remember that Rutherford B. Hayes didn't come from the radical wing of that party, so he wasn't too high on that anyway. But basically, Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, takes control of the White House and pretty much looks the other way while, these southern states restore their white democratic governments and create a situation where they start disenfranchising the African American population, Jim Crow laws, all of that kind of stuff. So that is the election of 1876 and the Compromise of 1877 in a nutshell. So we've got Ray J. Berg, Alex Red, the Prudent Manager, and Cabbage Fan. Thank y'all so much for the Instagram follows. This cabbage _ fan. It's just a bunch of pictures of cabbages and Brussels sprouts. This is one of the most bizarre. Oh my Lord, is that even league? Oh my goodness. Somebody told me to follow that account on Twitter. Okay, give me a break. I didn't mean to shout out to that account. All right. So Noah L 2001. Thank y'all so much for the follows on Instagram. All right. So as far as that goes, the Freeport, the Freeport doctrine, let me make sure I'm giving you the right thing. Okay. Some of these things, I can tell you the thing. I mean, I'm pretty sure this. Yeah. So Stephen Douglas. Okay. So what's going on here is when Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln are running in 1858 for the Senate in Illinois. Now, remember, the Democrats still controlled the legislature, and it was the legislature that was going to vote. But they still had these Lincoln Douglas debates. They had a series of debates, in Illinois. And what happened here, it's kind of interesting stuff, because when you look at POV analysis, both of these men are running for Senate. Now, Stephen Douglas had presidential aspirations. Abraham Lincoln, I'm sure on some level did too, even though he was, by comparison, an unknown at the time. But basically what happened here is Lincoln was in the situation where he couldn't be too, hard on, some of these issues. He had, I mean, he was living in a very racist state and all of that kind of stuff. But Lincoln, the free soiler, what he did was he trapped Douglas. All right. So Douglas, in order to win the battle, lost the war because Lincoln really harped on this Dred Scott decision. When you look at Lincoln's House Divided speech, he says that basically the Dred Scott decision says that slavery can be brought to any territory. Now, what is to stop the Supreme Court from deciding that slavery can be brought into any state? Now, the odds of that ever happening were slim to none. But of course, a good politician, looks at they thrive on paranoia and fear and stuff like that. So, I mean, Lincoln really made some, some brilliant, like populist arguments, very, lawyered, great mind on the guy. And what he did was, a lot of people were upset about the Dred Scott decision. And so, Lincoln puts Douglas in the position. He's like, look, what if there's a community of people that doesn't want slavery out there in the West? What do? And Douglas basically said, because he couldn't be seen as a Southern stooge, or a dough face or whatever, he essentially said that, well, you know what, people could ignore Dred Scott, that they can just kind of like, okay, so, they can ignore it. If they didn't, if they didn't want to support slavery, they could pass laws or whatever. Now, this allows Stephen Douglas to win the election, but it kills his chance for the presidency. That's when the Democratic Party in 1860 had their convention in Charleston. And, then they got together, they nominated Stephen Douglas. Most of the Southern delegates walked out because Stephen Douglas in 1858 had said that these communities, if there is an anti-slavery community out West, they can basically ignore Dred Scott. That made him absolute poison for the Southern political class. And so, that led to, Douglas losing that election, Lincoln winning that election. So basically Lincoln put Douglas in a position where he had to say something to win that election that cost him an election later. You imagine if the Lincoln Douglas debates hadn't happened, like President Stephen Douglas elected in 1860, and like how would that have gone? Like just all kinds of neat little hypotheticals there. But anyway, it has certainly been a pleasure hanging out with y'all for a little bit tonight. I would like to, let's see if there are any questions that are like really, really quick to answer. LA, you are just look up APUSH DBQ. I've got a video on that. So go into YouTube, look for APUSH DBQ. Jada already went over Reconstruction a little bit. Already did your reading guide, yada, yada, yada. Okay. Yeah. Oh, goodness. Yeah. I'm not going to get buried in that concept outline, Embryo Caesar. Gosh, that thing would make me want to put a bullet in my head if I spent too much time in that. All right. There's Beth. I like Beth. All right. If anybody's in Miss Feast class in Wisconsin, in Kenosha, Wisconsin. All right. So as far as that goes, ladies and gentlemen, thank y'all so much. Remember, my Romulus APUSH review app is available at the App Store and at Google Play. My 8-month writing clinic has got some great stuff. Is my friend JC watching this thing here? Just got a text from my friend JC, and I've really got to, when JC texts here, I've got to at least check it. All right. Yeah, JC, we could talk about that kind of stuff, between you and me some other time. But yeah, I mean, certainly, anytime there's war, JC. Now, the War of 1812 would probably be a very very clear like exception. And James Madison's often praised for that the government didn't crack down on civil liberties, during the War of 1812. But certainly, there were some crackdowns on civil liberties. But then again, the government does have the authority to suspend habeas corpus in certain cases in times of war. So, there's definitely been a lot of back and forth about the constitutionality of some of Lincoln's actions, in the Civil War. What happened with Clement Vallandigham, the Copperhead, is kind of interesting, even though Lincoln, what Lincoln did with Vallandigham when he found out he'd been arrested, He was like, can't do that. That's not going to look good. So what he did is he arranged for Clement Vallandigham to be brought to the Confederate lines and let go. It's like you love the Confederacy so much. Why don't you just go over there and hang out with them or whatever? And then Vallandigham got on a steamer to Canada and then went back to Ohio, ran for governor and lost. Because the Copperhead movement had lost some steam there by 1864. So as far as that goes, but yeah, JC, I would love to talk to you more about that some other time. Shout out to all the great folks in Chapin, South Carolina. And so with that, remember the app, the writing clinic, Instagram, all that kind of stuff. Got a few Lonely Amore. Oh my goodness, more cabbages and unamused Katie. Okay, unamused Katie. I hope that you were at least a little bit amused. Well-behaved women seldom make history. All right, so keep that in mind, ladies and gentlemen. Whereas, yeah, all right. So as far as that goes, I think that we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. And I'll be back because midterms are coming up for some of you. So I'll be broadcasting a bit, a bit more in December because I know midterms are coming up. I want to make sure that that's accessible to y'all. If you're on tomritchie.net/apush, make sure to sign up for my email list if you have not done that before, because I didn't send that out this evening. I forgot about it, but typically when I'm going to broadcast, I send something out to my email list. So ladies and gentlemen, it's always a pleasure, and I will see you again soon.